Well, good afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon. Afternoon. There we go.
We're good, glad to see you. We continue our series of lessons this evening on our favorite songs. Tonight is just the one that Jim led us. Oh, Master, let me walk with thee. I want you to remember what you just sang. We'll have the words through the slides through up as we go. But I want you to think about what you thought about when you were singing this. And when you walk out, you may say, well, I didn't know that. And so it's interesting when you begin to study the history of the people that wrote these songs and the reasons for some of the songs, not all the songs, but some of the songs. And that's true tonight of the man who wrote our song. Washington Gladden is his name. And in the late 1700s and early 1800s and early 1900s, get it right in a minute, there became a movement, and the movement was called the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement was a movement religiously where people began to preach and to teach a social gospel. So much so that the gospel was centered upon the idea of social reform instead of individual reform. Now, we think about and we talk about individual reform, but social gospel was a reform of society. In other words, the flaws were not in man, but were in society. And so consequently, there were many efforts through the social gospel to rectify and change industries, wages, people from the standpoint of actions, government. Washington Gladden was one of those. Matter of fact, he was very big in the idea of fair and equal wages for everyone. Sort of a flat pay, I guess you could say, for everyone. And while he preached that, because he was a denominational preacher, he proclaimed that, and he worked towards that end. This song, interestingly enough, while spiritual overtones, is really bent on the idea of the social gospel and that teaching of that period of time. When we think about the idea of walking and walking with God, we understand that that's what God has told us to do. That God wants us to have this relationship with Him wherein we walk with Him. We studied not long ago, Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What does the Lord your God require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God? Colossians 2, verse 6, where Paul talks about that we're to walk with the Lord. God wants that relationship. Now, when we begin to say that, we begin to think about, relationships. What are relationships? Well, relationships are where people sit down and people talk and people do and people communicate and things of that nature. Well, that's the same with God. Maybe in the near future, I'm sort of planning a sermon just on the idea of a relationship with and building a relationship. But walking with God is important. Walking hand in hand with God is what is expected of each of us day by day. This song talks about walking with God. It first of all talks about walking in humble service. Oh, Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. Tell me thy secret, help me bear the strain of toil, the fret of care. In Washington Gladden's mind, this was the idea of let each one be equal and equality. That no one is different. That labor from the standpoint of management was, I guess you could say, overrated, and that he felt like they were unjust to everyone, which in that time frame, there was a certain sense in which that was true. But, O Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. As Christians, we understand the idea, and God has called us to humble service. Now, humble service is important because that's what God expects of us. Matter of fact, Jesus in Matthew chapter 20, verses 26 and 27, makes the statement that whoever among you wants to be great, let him be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you, verse 27, let him be your slave. The idea of servant and the idea of slave is not something that we particularly like to think about. But yet that's really what God has called us to. God has called us to be servants. Jesus was a servant. Jesus didn't mind getting down on his hands and knees and washing feet. Now it's interesting when you think about it. You remember that one of the discussions, for lack of a better term, one of the discussions amongst the apostles was that Mrs. Zebedee came in and she wanted her sons, James and John, to sit at the head table. She was more interested in the ops than she was in what needed to be done. And when the apostles sat there and Jesus washed the feet, the apostles had sat there. You see, Jesus was willing to touch the leper. He was willing to talk to the lady at the well. He was willing to go into people's homes and talk to them about the truth, as he did the day in which, remember, the lame man was lowered in front of him from the roof, or when he told Zacchaeus, go into your house today. Jesus was one that didn't mind this. He came and exemplified the idea of serving others. Matter of fact, he says in John 6, verse 38, that he came not to do his own will, the will of him who sent. That was Jesus' thought, and that was his preoccupation. And that's what he accomplished. He calls the same upon us to be individuals that don't think too highly of ourselves. While we don't esteem others better than ourselves, we are individuals that are service and service oriented. Paul reminds us of this, that we're not to look upon our own things, but also upon the things of others. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. That we're to help others. That we're to help them through the strain and the stress, the toils and the cares, as Gladden said in his song. It's interesting. Back years ago, I began a series of lessons on service and servanthood in church. And I had a sweet, sweet lady that was probably in her 90s at the time. Been in church all of her life. Her brother was one of my elders. She came up to me, I don't know, 3 or 4 lessons in, and she said, I didn't know the Bible had this much to say about service. I'm not saying that lady didn't serve. She did. She was a good servant of God. But at the same time, too, we need to understand God has called us to humble service, to do what we can. Now, God's never asked us to do above what we can do, but he's always told us to do what you can do, to be individuals that help others, to be those that are truly willing to roll up their sleeves. So Gladden reminds us that we as individuals need to walk in humble service, reminded, if you will, of a lady that I know. Let me back up so we're not ahead of ourselves. A lady that I know, met her, actually. Her sister would be, really her brother-in-law and his wife. But anyway, it was one of my members, and she was sick, and she was in the hospital, and unfortunately she ended up passing away, and her husband a little later on. But it was what would be his sister-in-law, his brother's wife. His brother and his brother's wife had lost a child. child was in a car wreck. And when this happened, this lady was distraught, as any of us would be. Folks began to send her cards, and she got one sympathy card after another. She made it then her ministry to send cards. And I was talking to her husband one time, and he said, it's the strangest thing I've ever seen. He said, I don't mind that she sends cards. He said, it's fine with me. But he says, we can go into the grocery store, not know anyone in the grocery store, and she walks out with 5 names and 5 addresses and is sending 5 cards the next day. I said, but she's doing a great thing, isn't she? He said, yes, she is. Help us, Lord, to help those that are walking through the strain and toil of life and the fret of care. But then secondly, the song says, help me, the slow of heart to move by some clear winning word of love. Teach me the wayward feet to stay and guide them in the homeward way. The idea of being sensitive. Help me, the slow of heart to move. The idea for Gladden was, help me to change everybody's mind. But then how he's going to do that is a kind and loving way, isn't it? By some clear winning word. Help me and teach me the wayward feet to stay and to show them the homeward way. What I thought in reality, to help others, to have the words. Lord, give me the words. Lord, give me what I need. Give me sensitivity. Give me sensitivity to people and to what's going on in their life. Help me to see, help my eyes to be open to see what's going on in their life instead of what's going on in mine. When I think of that, I often think of a gentleman that was a very good man in many ways. He was a confirmed bachelor. He was a college professor at a state school. He preached a lot. He was a very good speaker. And when I would go talk to him or speak to him or go somewhere where he was, I always enjoyed talking to him. But you would say, how are you doing? And he would say, fine, how are you? And you'd say, fine. And then you would begin to say something, and then he would say, Aunt so-and-so is fine. And Aunt so-and-so is not doing well. I had no clue who Aunt so-and-so and Aunt so-and-so were. Never met them before in my life. He did that to everybody. That was his life. And he wanted you to know those 2 ladies that were important to him, what was going on with them. And if you knew this man, you soon grew sensitive to the idea. And sometimes I asked, I can't remember their names now, but I asked about Aunt so-and-so and Aunt so-and-so before he could tell me, because I wanted to get it in before he would say anything. The Bible teaches us about Jesus and how sensitive he was to people. I think when I think of the sensitivity of Jesus, I can't help but think of the great story of what is called the widow of Nain. Do you remember the story? Do you remember the story where Jesus basically, if you will, restores son's health? Jesus sees this lady. We refer to her, because this is the text of Luke 7, as the widow of Nain. And her son has passed away. Jesus raises. How did he know that she was lonely? How did he know that she was by himself? Well, more than likely, of course, you could say, well, the knowledge that Jesus had himself. But the fact that funeral processions then, in a lot of ways, are like funeral processions today. Usually, in biblical times, you would have the casket first. And then right behind the casket, you would have the family And then right behind the family, you would have the mourners, and then right behind the mourners, you would have those visiting. Jesus saw this lady, and she's by herself now, having to bear up under the loss of a loved one, and Jesus took it and went a step further. See, he was sensitive to her needs. He was sensitive to what was going on with her. Jesus was sensitive to the untaught. Matthew 9, Jesus was sensitive to the blind. Remember when Jesus was walking by and there were those that cried out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy upon me. And there was the crowd saying, shh, be quiet. Don't bother him. And they hollered the louder. And Jesus stopped and healed them. Mark's account, and Mark has so many of the miracles of Jesus. Mark chapter 1, Mark talks about how the cities brought people to Jesus and he healed them. Well, preacher, he was doing that to attract a crowd. He was doing that to gather people's attention so that they would listen to what he had to say. He was also doing it because he was moved with compassion. He had sympathy towards those that were going through difficult times. So should we. So should we. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul reminds us, excuse me, that we're to walk in lowliness. We're to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we've been called, with all lowliness of mind. Paul reminds us. That idea of lowliness of mind is the idea of humility, yes, but it's the idea of being understanding. Understanding of the individual, of understanding what's going on. You see, the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle. Paul would tell Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. That's kind of an interesting oppositional point there. The servant of the Lord must not strive. The word strive there, I like what the New King James says. The servant of the Lord must not quarrel. The word strive there is the idea of strife from the standpoint of fighting. But while Paul would tell Timothy, the servant of the Lord must not strive, must not quarrel, must he be? He must be gentle. What's gentleness? Gentleness is the idea really of sensitivity, of helping those that have a need. Ebony Rhodes was an interesting lady. She was a mother of 3 children. Ebony was doing all she could for her family. Ebony Rhodes had 2 jobs and trying to hold her family together. She was single. Father of the children was not in the picture at all. She was struggling. With all of her might, she was struggling. She got into the hospital because she got sick, and so she missed being at work for a while, which consequently even made things worse. Things seemingly couldn't get any worse. Ebony got stopped. And when they stopped her because of a moving violation, they found out her driver's license had expired. She had no insurance. And so they impounded her car. You would say, well, that's a problem, but that's not a problem that's, something you can get over or around. No. Ebony's car was her home for her and her 3 children. A fellow by the name of Jeff Gailey was actually there, was the one that had to make sure her car was impounded. Jeff Gailey was the police officer, and he listened to her story. He felt so sorry for her. So the next day, he began to take up a collection amongst the police and anybody else, and those that he knew that had some influence in the community. And before long, he had enough money And he had been visiting Ebony from time to time, but he had not told her what he was doing. And before too long, a matter of a couple of weeks, he had Ebony in and her children in an apartment, had them set up, and had them set up well. And still to this day, Jeff visits Ebony. Why? Because she has adopted him as part of her family. But it's all because somebody cared. It's all because somebody was sensitive to the needs of the individual. And Washington Gladden in our song tonight reminds us too that we need to be sensitive to people, to their needs. Then thirdly, teach me thy patience still with thee in closer, dearer company, in work that keeps faith sweet and strong, in trust that triumphs over wrong. Teach me patience. Teach me, Lord, to wait, right? Well, a little different here in this song. But we need patience. Patience with people. We need to walk with patience. If we walk with sensitivity, if we're individuals that walk in humble service, we've definitely got to walk with patience in works that keeps faith sweet and strong, and trust that triumphs over wrong. God's called us to live a life of patience, to live a life that is patient with people. And that patience then requires us to have purpose and courage in our life. Patience does not mean that we give in and give up and go away. Patience just means we're willing to go the second mile. That's what Jesus taught after all, wasn't it? Whoever compels you to go with him a mile, go with him too. Matthew chapter 5, verse 41. That's the teaching of Jesus. But Jesus exemplified that idea by living a life of purpose and living a life of courage, but still being patient with people. One great example is when Jesus comes to cleanse the temple and cleanses the temple. When Jesus comes to the temple, he comes for the idea of worship, right? But when he gets there, what does he find? He finds money changers. Now, what's money changers? Well, remember in the temple, you couldn't put 2 or 3 Washingtons or Lincolns or whatever. You had to have specific money, type of money. And so the money changers would take your money and they would sell you the right money so that you could put it in the treasury. Sounds good. Yes. But 2 for 1 is not a good deal. Jesus didn't like the fact that they were changing money and they were selling. What were they selling? Sacrifices. People, after all, come to Jerusalem, come for a while. They couldn't bring the sacrifices that they needed. Well, we've got the wall of the day. Just come right on in and buy your sacrifice. Jesus said, this is not going to happen. While we see Jesus oftentimes as so meek of an individual that, he just wouldn't do anything. Jesus takes cord and makes whip out of it. He turns over the money tape of the money changers. He drives them out. He runs them out. That's not a little mouse running somebody out of the house. Can't you imagine? That is a full-fledged, full noise commotion. You might say, but why did he do that? Because he had folks that he said, you're not going to make the Lord's house a den of thieves. He understood that you need to be patient with people, that you need to go along with them, but at the same time, too, there's a sense of what's right and wrong. There's a purpose and a courage for life that needs to be lived. And Jesus did that. We, too, are to be individuals that are patient in spirit. After all, that's what love is. Love's patient, 1 Corinthians 13. But not only is love patient, but we're to be tender. We're to be individuals that are to be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love. We're serving one another. We're to be individuals that help others, but we're to be individuals that also, in our persistence with people and our patience with people, still have the courage to stand for what's right. When you think about Daniel in the 3rd chapter, you think about a man that was thrown into a lion's den. And he was thrown into a lion's den because of his courage for God. He wasn't willing to not pray to God. When you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you think about, and also in the book of Daniel, you think about guys of courage, of standing up for what's right. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, that we're to be individuals that are to watch, that we're to stand fast in faith. That we're to be individuals that practice what's true and we hold to what's true. Patient with people, sure. We're to be patient with folks. Folks don't always get it right. We don't always get it right. Folks don't always say and do the things that they need to say and do. But in work, that keeps faith sweet and strong. Trust that triumphs over wrong. Then we also see that we walk with hope. So we walk as individuals that are humble in spirit. We walk as individuals that are sensitive to the needs of others. We walk as individuals that are patient with people but have courage in our faith. And we walk with hope, in hope that sends a shining ray far down the future's broadening way. In peace that only thou canst give, with thee, O Master, let me live. Hope. Washington Gladden said, hope sends a shining ray, and it does, doesn't it? I mean, the thought of hope, the thought of tomorrow, it's a good thought. You know, the commercial now for NyQuil, for NyQuil Z is, it starts out, it's a husband and wife in bed, and he can't sleep. Why? Because it's Sunday. The idea is, which a lot of Americans have, they don't, got to go to work tomorrow. They get all keyed up and all excited, and they don't want to go. Well, then of course NyQuil Z, she gives him NyQuil Z, and he's asleep. And that's the last scene in the short commercial. We live life though. Tomorrow is a good thing. Tomorrow brings the possibility of what's new. Tomorrow brings the idea of hope that tomorrow will be better because of the newness of the things that are brought, because of the expectations that might be met, because of the anticipation of what might be. So hope sends a shining ray far down the future's broadening way, in peace that only you can give. How true he was in such a statement. That the peace that the world needs is God. The peace that passes all understanding, that Philippians 4, that the Prince of Peace that Jesus is. Isaiah 9, verse 6. Yeah. Oh, Master, let me walk with you. Why? Because you offer hope. Teach us to number our days that we may apply ourselves to wisdom, David said in Psalm 90 and verse 10. How important, how vital that is for us today. Why? Because we know that there's a judgment that's yet to be. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. We'll all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. You and I can't avoid that. That should not send a moment of terror to us, but a moment of hope. I've shared with several people just recently a conversation that I had with Suze. Every once in a while, I check the obituaries, especially of places where I've been, to see, maybe who's passed away, and maybe if I could send them a card or something. Now, when I look at the obituaries in most funeral homes, most of the folks that are dead or have passed away, are younger than me. Used to be different. Used to be older than me. Now they're younger than me. And it gets you to thinking about your own mortality and the possibilities. But then the conversation that I haven't really shared with anybody that Suzanne and I had, she said, yeah, but it gets you closer to what you've been working for. Thank you. When she said that, I think she was checking my insurance. But no. But we understand that we're headed in that direction. And so as we walk and we live our life, we live with hope. Not necessarily that tomorrow will be better, but we face a better tomorrow. So we walk in service. We walk as individuals that are sensitive. We walk as individuals with purpose, meaning. We walk with hope. Why? Because that's what God expects of us. So, Master, let me walk with thee is a song not necessarily it was meant for church, but not really because of the social aspect of which Washington Gladden had. Yet at the same point in time, too, he makes some great points for us to think about how we live our life. This evening, we ask you as you live your life and walk by faith, that if you're not in accordance to God's will and you need to straighten that out with God, we'll be glad to help you. Won't you come? While together we stand and sing.